Well, welcome back to Rooley Moor and another tale from the moor. And sadly again, this is a little bit of a sad tale. The only thing we get really are sad tales, aren't they? People dying or bad things happening. Very rare we get a good tale. And this is sad. And we're going back to 1914 on the eve of the Great War. August 1914. And a young lad aged 16 called William Albert Kershaw, who lived at 259 on Rooley Moor Road. Now, William wanted Pitman. He was just a 16-year-old lad who'd been at work for a couple of years. On one Sunday afternoon, him and his mates decided to go out, as you do on a Sunday afternoon in August, late summer. And they came up here onto the moors. Their idea was to walk right up, like many people had done for decades, on a Sunday afternoon to the moorcock up on Rooley Moor. About 1 o'clock, he met up with two of his mates. One of them was called William Albert. But this time it was William Albert Holden. He was aged 19 and he was a warehouseman that lived on Balfour Road. And there was also another lad, but he's not named. So they set off and they wandered up the moors. About 1 o'clock they'd met up. Maybe they intended going for a couple of pints in the moorcock. One of them was 19, obviously. William Kershaw was only 16, but we know they're quite lax up in the moorcock. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But anyway, at any rate, they decided against it. They got part way up onto the moors up here and decided, do you know what? We'll not bother with moorcock. We're just going to have a wander around the moors, which is what they did, which is what we did when we were young. We loved wandering round, looking at things and getting up to stuff. And they wandered round till, for the best part of the afternoon, till about 5 o'clock, when either by planning or by accident, because they were just on the way back down, they ended up here at Hunger Hill Colliery, which was by then abandoned. I don't know what was left of the pit, whether there were any buildings still left up, but the shaft was still here. It looked different to today though. You can see it's concrete lined over. It's 77 yard deep, that. Back in 1914 there was a 6-foot wall surrounding it, and there was stone flags on top of the shaft. And when they came down, they could see that some of the stones had been knocked off the top of the wall. And as lads do, well, there's an adventure. Let's get up. Why? Because we're not supposed to. So William Kershaw climbed the wall while his mates looked on. And then he jumped off the other side, out of view of the other two lads. Now then, they heard a loud splash, like something really heavy had fallen into the water. So the other William scrambled up the wall and he looks in horror over the top, because half of the shaft was now open and there was no sign at all of young William Kershaw. His mate had disappeared down the shaft, followed by half of the flags that were covering it. William Holden climbed over the top, and on the flags that were left, well, he jumped on top of them, putting his own life at risk, but he was anxious about his mate. And he looked over the top and he shouted down, "William! William!" Listened. But in that dark, inky blackness, there was no reply. He could see nothing. There was just an awful, imposing black hole. And his mate, as far as he knew, was right at the bottom. What were they going to do? As you can see, we're a long way from anywhere. Well, they must have run back down the moor, back to civilization, and raised the alarm. And eventually word got to PC Benson in Norden, and he came back up here with a massive rope. Now that must have been hard work, in fact, even carrying a rope long enough to go down here. By the time PC Benson had got here, well, there was a large crowd, and I dare say William Albert Kershaw's family were here also. His dad was called Schofield. It was his stepdad, actually. So you can imagine what the crowd must have been feeling, the anxiety of the parents. But how were they going to get the young lad out? How were they going to get down to them? Well, they were holding out for a hero, and one came in the shape of a colliery deputy. James Henry Fleming was a fireman or a deputy at Lower East Knoll, again one of Lomax's pits. He was aged 46 and he lived on Moss Row at Norden. Moss Row's that really long road near the old Black Pits colliery where the three lads were killed. Now he volunteered to go down the shaft, lowered down by a rope tied to his waist. Now, he possibly had worked here before, I don't know. I'm only surmising that, we don't really know, do we? But obviously he must have known a little bit about the pit. Nevertheless, he was lowered down, he tied the rope round his waist and he was lowered down. Was there some form of winch? Nothing says whether there was or wasn't. It's probably quite doubtful. It was probably manhandled down, if you will, people holding the rope as he went down.
So just try and imagine going down that shaft just tied to a rope, inch by inch, foot by foot. Possibly there was water oozing out the side of the shaft, making his feet slip, and perhaps he wasn't even shod in the correct footwear. He had his best suit on, and as he looked up at those anxious faces as they disappeared, as he descended into the inky darkness, what did he have to light the way? Did he have a candle? An oil lamp? Who knows? But he would just have had one free hand, one on the rope, one hold of his light as he slowly made his way down there. What was going through his mind? Can you put yourself in his position? And what would he find at the bottom?
And he got down a distance of 45 yards, possibly to that landing that goes off into the Sandrock mine. And there he found young William Albert Kershaw, laid on his left-hand side, stone dead obviously. There was part of the flags that covered the shaft were on his legs. He'd got a really bad cut, deep wound to his scalp as well, and it looked like his neck was dislocated. In all intents and purposes, well, he was, and he was probably dead actually the moment he hit that landing. James tied the rope around young William Albert and they hauled him up to the surface. That itself, if they were doing it by hand, would have been no mean feat. You know, would have took a lot of strength to do that. And afterwards, James had to make that 45-yard ascent up that shaft. And just imagine what it was like down there, let alone the disturbance of having somebody, you know, the poor lad died. But just that black hole, what was beneath the landing where James was on? Was it a solid landing? Just black inky water? There was another 30-odd yard of nothing or liquid death beneath him. Total darkness apart from maybe a candle and just an eerie, still disturbing place to be. Anyway, by the time they got young William out, it was about 9:30. He'd gone down there at 5 o'clock, 4.5 hours earlier. At the inquest, the coroner sort of mentioned how ludicrous it was that somebody had already pushed some of the wall off the top. But he said maybe it might have been better had the shaft not been flagged. And he's got a point. If you'd have climbed the wall and seen an open shaft, you wouldn't have jumped on top of the flags, would you? But hindsight is a fantastic thing. Sergeant Hodgson, Police Sergeant Hodgson, really wanted to recommend James Fleming. He said how plucky he had been in going down the shaft and doing what he'd done. It was a really brave thing to do. But also, a side point, but a sign of the times, he'd ruined a new suit of clothes. Back then, people only maybe had one decent set of clothes, and that had been ruined in going down the shaft. So the sergeant moved that maybe he could, as well as having his name in dispatches, so to speak, be reimbursed. And Samuel Schofield, William's stepfather, he was a weaver actually, he said, yeah, he said, we're so grateful for what James did for our William. I'll give you a sovereign. And Lomax has said, yeah, don't worry, we'll pay the rest. So such a tragic loss for a life so young, but at least he's getting a mention now, isn't he? We can remember young William Albert and what happened to him here at Hunger Hill in 1914. 16-year-old tragically killed. But when we think about the time period, what may have lay in front of young James and his friends in the next 4 years, that's something to ponder on. Anyway, join us the next time when we have another tale from the moor.